In the summer of 1892, a traveling pastor arrived in a remote Appalachian hollow, carrying a tattered satchel and a warning he would never share aloud. Inside his satchel, among the Bible and hymnals, was a single folded page, its edges browned, its ink blotched with what looked like water but smelled faintly metallic. It had been handed to him at nightfall by a trembling farmhand who whispered, "Burn this if you want to sleep again." The pastor didn't burn it. Not at first. He read it by lamplight, and the words carved themselves into his mind so deeply that for the rest of his life he couldn't preach without seeing that page in his mind's eye. The letter read, "He has married his own stepdaughter. Or perhaps it is worse. For by marrying her, he has made her both his daughter and his wife, and she has become her own stepmother. The children are born strange. The old women in the hollow say it is because the blood has looped back on itself, like a snake swallowing its tail." The pastor later claimed that when he finished reading, he felt the walls of his boarding room closing in. He burned the letter in the oil lamp, but not before copying its most chilling line into his private journal. She is her own stepmother. That journal, lost for over a century, was discovered in 2011 inside the crawl space of an abandoned mountain church. From that single line, historians and genealogists pieced together the tale of the Collier family of East Tennessee, a story so grotesque and convoluted that even today, many locals refuse to speak the name. The Collier patriarch, Elijah Collier, was born in 1846. He came of age in a valley where kinship and isolation blurred the lines of propriety. His first marriage was ordinary by mountain standards, a neighbor's daughter, Sarah May, 6 children, a life of scraping by on corn, hogs, and timber. But in 1881, Sarah May died suddenly after her 7th pregnancy. Elijah buried her in the family plot, but instead of collapsing into grief, he began to preach that her death was a sign. He told neighbors that God had shown him a vision, a family that would remain unbroken, a bloodline untainted by strangers. The way he interpreted that vision would twist the Collier name into a curse. 2 years later, Elijah remarried. His new wife was not a stranger at all. It was Sarah May's eldest daughter, his own stepdaughter Lydia, only 16 years old. The mountain folk whispered, but no one intervened. The law was far, the church was weak, and Elijah's word carried weight. He held the marriage in his own barn. Under a cross he carved himself, declaring it a holy union. And so Lydia became both bride and daughter. Her siblings now had to call her both sister and mother. By the next spring, she was with child. The birth was difficult, and the baby came into the world frail, its skin waxy and its eyes too far apart. The old women in the hollow shook their heads and whispered the same phrase the pastor would one day write down: "The blood has looped back on itself." But Elijah didn't stop. He declared the child a blessing, proof of God's will. He demanded silence from the family and obedience from Lydia, who at 17 was already both stepmother to her siblings and mother to her own half-brother. It was the beginning of a family arrangement that would defy morality, law, and nature itself, an arrangement that would earn the Colliers their place in the most twisted chapters of Appalachian history. By 1885, the Collier homestead had already grown into something the valley people whispered about. The 2-story log house on Black Hollow Ridge was no ordinary farm dwelling. Its rooms seemed to multiply like the family within, additions nailed onto additions, crooked staircases that led to doors opening into other doors, a floor plan that resembled less a home than a trap. Some neighbors began to call it the House of Many Names, for no one could agree what to call the women who lived inside. Was Lydia a daughter? A wife? Both? Were the younger children Elijah's or his wife's siblings, or both at once? The confusion wasn't just on the lips of outsiders. Inside the house, children called each other by overlapping titles. One boy was both uncle and brother to the same child. Another girl answered to sister in the morning and aunt by nightfall. Elijah encouraged this chaos. He preached that worldly words like uncle or stepmother were useless labels meant to divide what God had united. To him, there was only one true name, Collier. And yet the cracks showed early. Lydia, who had once been a spirited girl, was now little more than a pale shadow. Neighbors recalled seeing her carry firewood with her head bowed, never meeting a man's gaze. Her children, thin and wide-eyed, clung to her skirts, but recoiled from Elijah's heavy hand. The local doctor, when summoned for a sick child, returned only once. He wrote in his ledger that the family presented cases of weakness and deformity, consistent with unnatural unions. After that, he refused to ride up Black Hollow Ridge again. Still, Elijah's influence grew. Mountain isolation had always bred suspicion of outsiders, and many families began to treat him as a prophet. He preached that the world beyond the hollow was corrupted, that true strength came from keeping the bloodline pure. Some even allowed their daughters to attend his gatherings in the barn chapel. Most came back. A few didn't. By 1888, Lydia had given birth to 4 more children. Each carried marks whispered about in the valley. A boy with a twisted spine, a girl with a cleft palate, an infant whose skin was said to bruise at the slightest touch. Yet Elijah insisted these were signs of divine testing, not of sin. The strangest part of all was how the family began to believe it. The younger children, raised in the confusion of the household, accepted the overlapping titles as normal. They played among the crooked staircases of the house, chanting the hymns Elijah composed, hymns that repeated the same words over and over: one family, one blood, one name. It was around this time that the first disappearance occurred. A neighbor's daughter, 12 years old, vanished after fetching water from the creek. Her family searched the valley for days, but no trace was found. Only a single ribbon, caught on a thorn bush near the Collier property. The sheriff asked Elijah if he had seen anything. Elijah smiled and said, "The Lord provides what he wills." The sheriff never came back. From then on, Black Hollow Ridge grew silent. Families kept their distance. Travelers avoided the road that passed near the Collier house. And yet smoke always rose from its chimneys, and the sound of children's voices, half singing, half chanting, echoed across the valley at dusk. The house of many names had become something more than a home. It was a fortress of silence, a place where family, faith, and fear melted into one. And inside its walls, the line between mother and sister, husband and father, stepchild and spouse, blurred into a darkness no outsider could unravel. By the early 1890s, the Collier homestead had stopped being just a house and had become a pulpit. Elijah, aging but still commanding, turned his kitchen table into a kind of altar. Neighbors who dared to step inside later described the walls, lined with crude scripture written in charcoal. "Keep the blood, keep the bond," repeated dozens of times. These were not Bible verses. They were Elijah's own words, twisted into doctrine. He preached that the outside world was broken, cities filled with sickness, marriages built on lies, churches corrupted by greed. Only his family, he claimed, had been chosen to keep themselves whole. Wholeness to Elijah meant never letting outsiders dilute their bloodline. He told his children that marrying beyond the ridge would break God's covenant. And so, cousins married cousins, nieces married uncles, daughters were given to their father's brothers, and, most disturbingly, Lydia, once a daughter, was bound in marriage to the man she had called Uncle Elijah. At first, the surrounding families dismissed him as a backwoods eccentric, a crank who had trapped his own kin in a delusion. But then, strange things began to happen. Young men from neighboring farms reported that their sisters had been approached, In the Night by Collier Boys. Thin, pale youths who whispered that the prophet was seeking new brides. One girl, no more than 14, vanished for 2 weeks. When she returned, she refused to speak of where she'd been. Her parents packed their belongings and fled the valley before the season ended. Elijah's following, though small, became loyal. A handful of poor families on the ridge, beaten down by crop failures and isolation, allowed their daughters to attend Elijah's gatherings. These meetings took place in the barn chapel, where oil lamps flickered against warped beams. Survivors described rows of children lined up, their faces blank, chanting Elijah's invented hymns. Then he would rise, preaching of the circle of blood, a covenant stronger than law, stronger than church. Those who resisted found themselves targeted in quieter ways. Fences were broken in the night, livestock vanished. Barns caught fire, with no cause. Outsiders began to whisper that to cross Elijah Collier was to invite a curse. Inside the homestead, the doctrine took its toll. Lydia bore child after child, each more frail than the last. By the time she was 25, she looked twice her age, her hair streaked with gray, her hands cracked from labor. Yet Elijah still paraded her as proof of his faith. The daughter becomes wife, the wife becomes mother, and the circle is complete. The children themselves became the strangest testimony. They rarely spoke to outsiders, and when they did, it was in the clipped, repetitive language Elijah had drilled into them. Teachers who tried to educate them said the children stared blankly at chalkboards, sometimes repeating the same word for hours. Their drawings were worse. Crooked houses with too many windows, stick figures with arms wrapped around themselves in endless loops. By the mid-1890s, the Collier doctrine had spread just far enough to alarm county officials. A census taker, after visiting the ridge, filed a report that listed nearly 30 children living under one roof, all bearing the same surname. Their relationships marked as unclear. He described the experience as a household where time and blood run in circles, never straight. The report was quietly filed away, but locals passed it around like a warning. What most frightened the valley, however, were the nights when voices carried down the ridge. Witnesses spoke of hearing chanting long after midnight, men, women, and children repeating Elijah's words in eerie unison. Sometimes the hymns would break into screams, followed by silence. No sheriff ever dared intervene. The Collier homestead was no longer just a house of secrets. It had become a church of blood, where family and faith were fused into a doctrine darker than any scripture. And each new child born into that house, frail and silent, was proof that the doctrine was not only believed, it was enforced. By the turn of the century, Elijah's household had become both a spectacle and a threat. Outsiders knew something was wrong. They whispered of children with hollow eyes, of women who never left the property, of a church where no outsiders were welcome. But in small Appalachian towns, whispers rarely became action. That is, until the fire. In the summer of 1901, smoke rose from the ridge one night, carrying a smell so sharp and acrid that farmers 5 miles away described it as like burning hair and tar. By dawn it was clear the Collier barn, Elijah's chapel, had gone up in flames. Neighbors, fearing the fire would spread, ran toward the ridge with buckets and blankets. What they found sent many running back down in silence. Children stood in the yard in straight rows, bare feet on the ash, faces streaked with soot, but showing no emotion. Behind them, Elijah towered like a prophet in ruin, his beard singed, his eyes wild. Beside him, Lydia, his wife, his niece, his doctrine's proof, clutched an infant that didn't cry, its tiny face ghost pale in the firelight. When a neighbor asked what had happened, Elijah raised his hand and declared, "The fire takes what is unworthy. The circle cannot be broken." Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the blaze had been set from within, that Elijah himself had chosen to burn the chapel to test his flock. Others swore they saw small bodies carried into the flames, offerings to a covenant that demanded more than loyalty. No official record ever confirmed this, but in the valleys and hollows, the story was told and retold. The Colliers had sacrificed their own. The county sheriff rode up the ridge the following week, but his visit ended abruptly. According to a surviving deputy's account, Elijah refused to allow entry onto the property. When the deputy threatened to force his way in, dozens of family members, men, women, even children, stepped forward in silence, blocking the path. Their faces were blank, their hands clasped as though in prayer. The sheriff turned back. His report read only 3 words: "Not worth pursuing." But the fire left scars. For the first time, a few of Elijah's followers wavered. One young woman, a cousin who had married into the clan, fled the ridge under cover of darkness with her infant child. She told townsfolk that the baby had been marked as unworthy by Elijah and destined for the next fire. Her words were half mad with fear, but her testimony carried weight. The townsfolk took her in. The baby, however, did not survive the winter. Still, Elijah's hold remained. If anything, the fire strengthened the myth. To those still loyal, it proved their prophet's power, that even destruction was part of the covenant. And to outsiders, it made the Colliers untouchable. No one wanted to confront a man willing to burn his own church to ash, perhaps even his own kin. Over the next decade, the homestead sank deeper into silence. Smoke rose less often from chimneys. Children were rarely seen. When a census taker braved the ridge in 1910, he found fewer families than expected, their numbers shrinking though Elijah's children were many. He noted gaps in ages, missing names, unexplained absences. The report was filed under irregularities and forgotten. But for those living near the ridge, the silence was worse than the fire. It was the silence of doors nailed shut, of fields untended, of songs and laughter never heard. It was the silence of a family turned inward, shrinking into itself, bound by blood and by fear. And at the center of that silence was Elijah Collier, now an old man, but still fierce in his belief that the circle must never break. To him, the fire had been a cleansing. To the world outside, it was a warning. The Colliers had survived the flames, and so long as they endured, their secret endured with them. By the 1920s, Elijah Collier's fire-scorched chapel was nothing more than a skeleton of charred beams. Yet his rule remained unbroken. Even as his beard turned white and his steps faltered, the patriarch's voice carried the weight of law. He had declared himself the eternal head of the family, and until his final breath, no decision, no union, no child could happen without his word. The children who grew beneath his roof had never known a world beyond his teachings. Daughters became wives before their bodies had grown into women. Sons became fathers while still boys, their faces bearing the same pale eyes and slack expressions as the uncles, cousins, and brothers who had come before. The bloodline was folding inward tighter and tighter, a circle collapsing into itself. But with Elijah's decline came fractures. One of his daughters, Ruth, was betrothed not to a cousin nor to a brother, but to Elijah himself. She was 15. To outsiders, such a claim would have been unthinkable, but in the hollow, it was spoken of as inevitable. The prophet keeps what is pure, Lydia was overheard whispering, as if to reassure herself. On a winter night in 1923, Elijah summoned the family to his dying bed. Lanterns glowed dimly in the cramped cabin. His voice was little more than a rasp, yet every child and grandchild leaned in to hear. He named Ruth his last bride and commanded that no one outside the family ever be allowed to take her. "She is both my daughter and my wife," he croaked. "The covenant is sealed." When Elijah finally died days later, his burial was swift and secretive. No preacher was called, no records were filed. The only witnesses were the colliers themselves, lowering his body into a shallow grave behind the house. By sunrise, the earth was tamped down flat, the mound indistinguishable from the ground around it. But his death did not free Ruth. Instead, it deepened her captivity. She became the property of Elijah's eldest son, Thomas, who claimed her on the grounds that she was already of the covenant and belonged only within the bloodline. With Elijah gone, Thomas declared himself the new patriarch. Where Elijah had ruled with prophecy, Thomas ruled with fear. Neighbors recalled hearing screams from the ridge that winter, piercing through the still night air. No one went up to investigate. The Collier children of this generation were marked more than ever by the curse of their closed circle. Teachers spoke of students with twisted limbs, slack jaws, or eyes that wandered without focus. Some refused to speak at all, sitting silently until the bell rang, then shuffling home without a word. One teacher later wrote in her journal, "They look as though they are fading before my eyes." That journal entry was never included in the school's official reports. By the 1930s, Ruth was a shell of the girl she had once been. Witnesses described her as moving slowly, almost like a sleepwalker, her face expressionless, her hair hanging in brittle strands. She bore children to her brother-turned-husband, but none survived infancy. The graves multiplied behind the cabin, tiny, unmarked, sinking into the weeds. When townsfolk asked questions, the Colliers answered only with silence. And if a stranger pressed too far, he was met with a wall of stares, dozens of pale, unblinking eyes that sent even the boldest men back down the ridge. The last photograph ever taken of the family, a faded snapshot from 1935, shows Ruth standing in the center. Her face is blurred, her eyes appearing too wide, almost hollow. Around her, children and adults alike wear the same blank expression, the same warped features, as though time itself had carved them from the same mold. Elijah's circle had not broken. It had only tightened, and in the tightening, it erased everything, names, voices, futures, until nothing remained but the silence of the bloodline. By the mid-20th century, the Collier homestead had collapsed into ruin. Its cabins sagged inward, porches caved beneath decades of rot, and weeds crept through the cracks where barefoot children once stood. On county maps, the ridge was little more than a blank space. Yet among locals, the silence still carried weight. Mothers warned their children never to wander there. Old men swore they'd seen pale faces watching from the tree line. And hunters told of bones unearthed by rain. Skulls, too small, spines curved like broken branches. The Collier bloodline, in official terms, had ended. No more births were registered under their name. No more children walked the long dirt road into town. But whispers refused to die. One story told of a young woman spotted in the 1960s, barefoot and wild-eyed, carrying an infant that never cried. Another claimed the Colliers had scattered into neighboring families, blending into the community, but carrying with them the same unmistakable eyes, hollow, unblinking, colorless. Some believe the family line still lingers, buried in new surnames, hidden in plain sight. Others insist the fire of their own corruption consumed them entirely, but the land itself seems to remember. Travelers speak of an unnatural stillness on the ridge, as if the air grows heavier the higher one climbs. Birds go quiet. Dogs refuse to enter. And sometimes, if the wind shifts, it carries the faint sound of children's voices, whispering, in tones too faint to understand. Historians, when pressed, tread lightly. Few official records survive, and those that do are often contradictory. But patterns emerge. Missing marriage licenses, erased census entries, and repeated names circling back on themselves. Again and again, fathers becoming husbands, daughters becoming brides, children born into a covenant no child should bear. The truth, once glimpsed, refuses to be buried. What makes the Collier saga so disturbing is not only what they did, it is how long they endured. Nearly a century of marriages folded inward, a cycle passed down as though it were law, ritual, even faith. Generation after generation living and dying under the shadow of a patriarch who declared himself God's mouthpiece. A family chained, not by iron, but by blood itself. Even now the echoes remain. Hikers who stumble across the ridge at dusk claim to hear footsteps behind them, though the trail lies empty. Photographers who set up cameras in the clearing return to find their film scratched, frames blurred, faces half-formed in the shadows. Locals say it is not ghosts that linger, but the family's curse, etched so deep into the soil it will never fade. And so, the Collier story survives not in history books, but in whispers. A tale too grotesque to tell in full, too painful to ignore. She became her own stepmother, her children became her siblings, her father became her husband. A circle that turned upon itself until the line vanished into silence, but silence does not mean absence. The land remembers, the trees remember. And if you listen closely enough on a quiet Appalachian night, you may still hear it. The faint sound of a lullaby, sung by a mother who was also a daughter, rocking a child who would grow to become both. Brother and son, this is not legend, this is not folklore, this is the darkest truth Appalachia ever buried.